Well, welcome to this third presentation on wisdom literature of the Old Testament, choosing the way of life in an age of freedom. And in this particular presentation, we will look at the book of Ecclesiastes. And here I'll begin with just a short summary to give you an idea of what we'll be doing. So, Ecclesiastes gives us two wonderful gifts. Excuse me. First, the author forces us to face the brutal reality of human existence, but it doesn't end there. Beyond the hopelessness of our apparent reality, there is a deeper reality. The preacher offers the reality of a unified field theory in life under God, the roadmap that enables us to move from the meaninglessness of the human condition to eternal hope. Now, I know it's a big bite, but what I've just said will become, I think, clearer as we move along. Now, I trust you're all familiar with Ecclesiastes. If you've never read it, I hope this session will be an encouragement for you to do so. This book is classified as a wisdom book. And because it is a wisdom book, I think I've referred to that idea in my earlier presentations, it is also, at least to us, and perhaps to some extent to these first readers, a bit of a bizarre book. On the one side of the spectrum, it's been described as the work of I'm being facetious here, French existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre. Others view it as the work of a disillusioned and cynical preacher or philosopher. On the other side of the spectrum, some have described the author as the preacher of joy. In that perspective, the message of the book is to rejoice in the face of life's unresolved dilemmas. Now, when you read all the proposals that have been made to explain what this book is about, you start wondering whether all these people are in fact reading the same book. Fortunately, you're in luck. Today, I, otherwise known as the Frenchman, will resolve the enigma that Ecclesiastes represents. Now, two things to help us get at the most fundamental intent of the book. First, think of a river. Of course, you may want to know why. Why do I say that? I'll explain later. Just want to put that on the back burner for now. Second, in order to understand the book, it will help to talk about Jack. Now, it's not any particular Jack. It's not any Jack in particular. It's just Jack. And if your name happens to be Jack, I mean no offense. So, anyways, imagine, if you will, Jack. Jack is, let's say, 43 years old, right? It's an imaginary Jack. Jack has spent his entire life in the church. He's married. He's got 3 kids. He has a demanding job. Makes good money. He's got it all. Or does he? Lately, Jack has not been a happy camper. He's disillusioned with life. He feels boxed in. He's a little tired of his routine, his responsibilities. And then it dawns on him. His problem maybe has to do with that religious cage he's in. He needs a radical change of life. And so he decides to leave it all and start a new life, say in Spain, or maybe Jack isn't all that wealthy, so perhaps San Antonio will do. I was there a few years ago for a convention. It's a beautiful city. This is I think it's called the River Walk or River Park. Great place to go. So anyway, let's say Jack decides to go to San Antonio to start a new life. It's Sunday night. He's going to leave early on Monday morning, but he wants to at least let one person know. Right? It's all a big secret for now. So he phones you and he tells you what he wants to do. And if that were to happen to you, what would you tell Jack? right? What would you tell him? Now, that's a very interesting exercise because what you would need to tell Jack, presumably to discourage him from going to Spain or San Antonio, begins to give you an in on understanding what the book of Ecclesiastes is all about. You know what Jack really needs? He needs a reality check. And oddly enough, it's exactly how the book of Ecclesiastes begins. These are the words of the teacher, King David's son, who ruled in Jerusalem. Everything is meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Here I have to stop and make a couple of comments. The Hebrew word that is translated by meaningless is the word hevel. And hevel can be translated in a variety of ways, and that's what makes this book sometimes a little difficult to understand, because translators are not always, in my opinion, translating hevel appropriately in all the cases where it appears. So you've got to keep in mind that when meaningless or hevel is used, it can mean a whole different set of things. It can refer to something that is futile, meaningless, of course, transitory. It can refer to wind, something that's absurd, stupid, senseless, vain, pointless, disappointing, fleeting, fragile, or even flimsy. And when we read here, everything is utterly meaningless, that is basically the use of the singular in the plural, hevel, hevelim, right? Futile or futile big times. Everything is futile. So the bottom line here in this passage is that everything is futile and meaningless. So let me keep reading here. So what do people get for all their hard work? He's explaining now why he is of the opinion that life is meaningless. Generations come and go, but nothing really changes. The sun rises and sets and hurries around to rise again. The wind blows south and north, here and there, twisting back and forth, getting nowhere. The rivers run into the sea, but the sea is never full. Then the water returns again to the rivers and flows again to the sea. Everything is so weary and tiresome. No matter how much we see, we're never satisfied. No matter how much we hear, we're not content. History merely repeats itself. It's all been done before. Nothing under the sun is truly new. What can you point to that is new? How do you know if it didn't already exist long ago? We don't remember what happened in those former times. And in future generations, no one will remember what we're doing now. Everything is futile. Futile big times. Of course, what does that mean? And what does this passage have to say about the purpose of the book of Ecclesiastes? Now, at this point, with what I've said, you almost have enough to get at what the book is trying to do. But let me push it a little bit further. In order to understand this book, you have to take into account three things. And once you're aware of these three factors, I think you'll have what you need to get at the heart, at the core, of what this book is trying to do. First of all, it is a wisdom book. By definition, it cannot just be the work of some French existentialist who believes that human life is without meaning and significance. Wisdom writers have the task of convincing an audience, and I would say often a reluctant audience, of the legitimacy of the faith in Yahweh, and the folly of the alternatives. But we also need to remember that the wisdom writers do not use force to persuade. They persuade by engaging the reader into a compelling reflection. And that's where the oddness comes in. Wisdom books feel odd. I mean, Job feels odd if you've ever read it. It's a difficult book. Ecclesiastes, as you've already discovered, feels odd. But you know what would be really odd? It's as if those books did not feel odd. Now, that would be odd. They are supposed to feel odd because they're designed to catch our attention. I mean, just imagine a preacher, for example, who would start a message this way. And, if he said, oh, life sucks, ministry sucks, I'm out of here. And he started to walk away towards the back of the church. Well, that, I bet you, would catch the attention of the people listening, right? In fact, I would put it even more strongly. These books are designed to trap the reader. So here's a book, a biblical book yet, that declares that life makes no sense. Now, I don't know about you, but it catches my attention. Now, the one thing I know for sure is that the author is not trying to teach that life is meaningless, because it's a wisdom book. By definition, it can't be doing that. So there's got to be something else going on. Ecclesiastes has a very specific group of people in mind. The people he's targeting are not sure what they want to commit themselves to. There are those who entertain awful illusions about themselves and life in general. There are those who've become very cynical about the faith. They're lifting their nose at life under Yahweh and are very attracted to life under the sun. These are the ancestors of the modern day secularist. It's written for people who are looking for happiness, contentment, fulfillment, meaning. The problem with some of these people is that they think, in fact, they are thoroughly convinced to the point of arrogance, that they can find these things outside of God. These are the people I call the little cynics. Now, the third key to understanding what Ecclesiastes is about is to realize that there are three types of statements in this book, and that's something that even scholars don't always identify adequately. There are three kinds of statements. There are nihilistic statements, that appear to say that life is meaningless, right? There are also a good number of God statements that seem to say the opposite. And then we find, and this is where scholars miss this nuance, we find a number of what I call innocuous wisdom sayings. And the key to understanding the book of Ecclesiastes is to understand not only that there are such, three kinds of statements, but how they relate to one another. Okay, so the nihilistic statements, the purpose of these statements is to demonstrate that human life lived in a certain perspective is entirely and completely devoid of meaning. The God statements are statements that seem to contradict the nihilistic statements. And then we have this category of proverbs, right? These innocuous wisdom sayings that include very obvious and straightforward truths that are self-evident and obvious to everyone. Okay, so those are the kind of sayings that you can't really debate because they are self-evident. It's like saying, well, water is wet, or Winnipeg winters are cold or tough. And I hear that you also have tough winters in Saskatchewan, right? The challenge is to understand how they work together. Now, you've heard the expression fighting fire with fire. I don't know where it comes from, but it works really well. A few months ago, we had a fire start in our bedroom, And my wife was very concerned. She was about to phone 911, but I said, no need for that, because I remember the saying, we're going to fight fire with fire. So I started a fire in the kitchen, and when the two met, they canceled each other. That's a terrible joke. No, we had no fire. Don't worry. It's just, I'm just trying to be funny. Anyways, the preacher's strategy is to fight cynicism, right? The cynicism of his audience, cynicism towards God, with his own brand of cynicism. But in this case, he aims his cynicism at the ideology, the worldview that the little cynics believe will give meaning to their lives. There is indeed cynicism in the book of Ecclesiastes. There's no doubts about it. But the cynicism of the author has a very specific target. And that target is what he calls life under the sun. Now, the reason why the book is so confusing is because the super cynic preacher, as I call him, does two things simultaneously. On the one hand, he deconstructs what the young cynics think is so great about their own philosophy. And what he does is he deconstructs life under the sun, which is, by now you know, those are code words for life away from the God of Israel. He does it systematically, methodically, and passionately. He does it by showing the intrinsic incoherence of the worldview that they have, and by pushing to their logical conclusions the fears and insecurities that are intrinsic to life under the sun. He shows it for what it really is, a huge illusion. But that's not all that he does. He doesn't, Kohelet, as he's called, right, the author of Ecclesiastes, he doesn't leave us in front of a gaping hole like, some French existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre. While he deconstructs one ideology, he reconstructs an alternative, a wonderful alternative, what I call a comprehensive worldview, a unified field theory. And by the time he's finished, he shows us how incredibly foolish life under the sun is, and how wonderful and dynamic and rich life under Yahweh is. So this reconstruction finds its climax in chapters 11 and 12. So it's a little bit like, two puzzles that you are trying to put together at the same time. So there is the deconstruction. So he shows his audience that what they call life under the sun, whatever that might be, is really ultimately an illusion and leads nowhere. So you've got all the passages that do that, but at the same time, he offers an alternative, and of course the alternative, you could call life under God, and there he offers a unified field theory that makes sense of everything. Okay? So, let's begin with life under the sun and the exercise in deconstruction that Kohelet is trying to do. So, he's basically saying, you think you'll find meaning and significance and happiness in life under the sun, right? Do I have news for you? Life under the sun is entirely and completely futile and without future. The preacher, right, the author of Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, is brutal in his attack. He comes to the little cynics and he says, really nice worldview you have there, nice philosophy of life that you have there. It would be too bad if something happened to it. And he tells them, and this is where it gets really brutal, it doesn't matter what you do, what you accomplish, what you know, or who you know. In the end, if you're going to live just under the sun, it all comes to nothing. Do you know why? Here's why, he tells them, we all die. In that sense, we have nothing over a simple dog. The dog dies, we die, end of the story. That's life under the sun. Here's a sample. For the wise and the foolish both die. The wise will not be remembered any longer than the fool. In the days to come, both will be forgotten. So I came to hate life because everything done here under the sun is so troubling. Again, that coded language, right? That coded expression. Everything is meaningless, hevel, like chasing the wind. It's futile, it's stupid. I came to hate all my hard work here on earth, for I must leave to others everything I have earned. So what basically the preacher does here is highlights the foibles of human life. Those absurd aspects of human life that we try to ignore. Well, the preacher singles them out like a sharpshooter and pushes them to their logical conclusion. Now, most of us manage to be relatively okay, despite the inherent absurdities of life, because we don't think that far. But the preacher won't allow it. He pushes on the incoherence of life until it breaks his audience. And as he deconstructs the little cynic's worldview, their philosophy of life, he offers an alternative that he puts gradually and strategically in the book as we read it. And so he presents life under God. Here's a sample of one of the texts that could be classified as God statements. Yet God has made everything beautiful for its own time. He has planted eternity in the human heart, but even so, people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from beginning to end. So I concluded there is nothing better than to be happy and enjoy ourselves as long as we can. So here we have one of these verses that begins to offer an alternative to the meaninglessness of life under the sun. But before I explain what this new worldview consists of, let me just say a few words about the third kind of sayings that I mentioned earlier and why it is in the book. So, as I said earlier, the book of Ecclesiastes has a whole series of very obvious wisdom sayings, the kind of self-evident principles or maxims that no one can really argue with. So here's a couple of examples. Ecclesiastes 4:5, fools fold their idle hands, leading them to ruin. You don't have to be Einstein to figure out that when you do nothing, you become poor, right? Because most of us are not born with, a mouthful of silver, as some people are. Ecclesiastes 4:9, two people are better off than one. Of course they are, for they can help each other succeed, right? Basically, self-evident sayings. But now the question is, why are they before us, right? And this is where you're in luck. I'm going to explain to you why these self-evident sayings are in the book. Now, you've got to understand this is very, very simple and I think pretty self-evident, but let me say it anyways. People are not computers. And by this I mean that, if you're having a discussion with someone, if you're having a debate with someone, you're trying to convince someone of something, you can offer the best arguments possible to support a particular position. You can crush your opponent with your brilliant arguments, but crushing somebody is not persuading that person. Wisdom teachers are in the business of winning people, not crushing them. The other thing we need to realize too is that to debate in the field of worldviews is extremely delicate. There's a reason why we tend to shy away from discussing politics or discussing religion. It's because both of these topics deal with beliefs that we hold dearly. And that makes any kind of discussion, at least in our culture, makes any kind of discussion of these issues very, very delicate. And the thing is, people will not necessarily jump from one way of viewing the world to another. Sometimes they need a bridge to move from the one to the other. And this is exactly what Kohelet offers. He offers a bridge. Kohelet is a master of persuasion. His ultimate purpose is to not to humiliate his opponents or merely to win an argument. His objective is to promote life. So Kohelet's strategy goes beyond offering a choice between two radically opposed options. The author of Ecclesiastes proposes a way to facilitate the transition from meaninglessness to significance by inserting throughout his work a number of sayings that address the self-evident value of wisdom in everyday life and the equally self-evident liability of folly. These passages cannot be simply labeled as under the sun or under God. They are there simply to show the absolute advantage of wisdom over folly. Day-to-day wisdom becomes the road to considering life under God. Kohelet's strategy is brilliant. Even if the reader agrees with the premise that life lived within the parameters of a flat horizon is indeed meaningless, providing no ultimate design for human existence, the reality is that there are still attitudes and actions that make sense and are intrinsically good. All things considered, wisdom is indeed superior to folly, right? We see evidence of that in everyday life. Once this is granted, the reader is now faced with the obligation to consider the question that must logically follow. If human existence is indeed utterly absurd, how can there be here and there rays of significance? There must be an ultimate source of wisdom that is beyond and above human experience. And that source is God himself. And here I'm just restating an argument that C.S. Lewis, I believe it was in his Mere Christianity, makes in terms of explaining why he moved from atheism to deism, that is belief in God and eventually belief in Jesus Christ. He was an atheist because he believed there was no order, there was only chaos in the universe. But then he started to think, well, how do I know the difference between chaos, like say a crooked line, and a straight line? That's because he had the notion already there of a straight line. So he says if everything was really chaos, if there was absolutely no order in the universe, he wouldn't even know it. And so that led him to the idea that in fact there must be a straight line somewhere, there must be a source of order against which he had this feeling of chaos, this notion of chaos, and eventually he came to the conclusion that that source of a straight line of order must be God himself. And now for the argument in a nutshell. ultimately, what the preacher offers is an alternative to life under the sun. It's what I call the unified field theory. Now, if you look at life under the sun, that is, life as it appears, life will prove to be incoherent, meaningless, and absurd. You can't escape it. But if you look at life under God, then life as it appears can be inserted into a broader framework that can infuse life with meaning. Life under the sun makes no sense in and of itself. For life under the sun to make sense, it must be put into a broader perspective, that is, life under God. Only then does human life and everything that is part of it begin to make sense. So, where does that leave us? Most of us are not cynics who are ferociously opposed to God or the life of faith. The fact that you're listening to this presentation, for example, is a proof of that. But if truth be told, as we get older, questions, doubts, maybe protests may emerge out of our hearts. Intellectually, we may know that faith in God is the thing to have and practice, but experientially, we often, too often, struggle with the absurdity of life, with evil, with old age, illness, and eventually with death. Now, we can respond in a number of ways to this existential absurdity of life. We can try to ignore it. We can become obsessed with it. We can find refuge in the past. This is what many of us do, the good old days, right? We can even try to rebel against it and against God. Or, sadly, we can sink into despair. We can do any one of those things, or we can take to heart what Ecclesiastes has to say. Life is very much like a river. It's a river that we can't stop. Whatever comes our way, pleasures, wealth, good health, human accomplishments, respect, you know what? We have to be honest. All of these things we can't hold on to. Trying to hold on to any of the good things of life, the things we cherish, is futile. Futile big times, right? For those who live under the sun, this inability to hold on to all these things can and will produce frustrations. It will produce resentment, meaninglessness, and anger. It can turn into an obsessive and self-destructive attempt at holding on to the past or even trying to recreate it. Under the perspective of God, we're offered a unified field theory, a way to make sense of it all. Now, human existence is not just one big accident. We know that there is a greater perspective. There is a loving God who has designed the basic parameters of human existence. Now, knowing that, accepting it, believing that it emerged out of a loving heart, out of a mind, out of reason, changes everything. First of all, it enables us to accept the limitations of human life as part of God's design. Understanding that there is a loving God above it all not only keeps us from becoming overly frustrated, but it enables us to accept and welcome the reality we live in. In so doing, it truly frees us to enjoy whatever pleasures and joys life has to offer without constantly trying to hang on to them. This attitude also frees us to look towards the future, and you will agree that that is a great gift to be able to do that. So no matter where we are, we can look towards the source of the river because this is where God is. So what is the bottom line when it comes to the book of Ecclesiastes? Just going to mention briefly a few of them. First of all, don't be paralyzed by fear. Chapter 11, 1 to 6. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just a couple of verses. Send your grain across the seas, and in time profits will flow back to you. But divide your investment among many places, for you do not know what risks might lie ahead. When clouds are heavy, the rains come down. Farmers who wait for perfect weather, some of you may know about that. Farmers who wait for perfect weather will never plant. If they watch every cloud, they never harvest. Right? In the life under God, we can live with confidence because we know that God is in our future. Regardless of what we may think about World War II, the young men who came back from the front feared nothing. My uncle was one of those. They had looked at the devil in the eyes and conquered. And when they came back, they married, they had children, they built, they looked forward. In contrast, our younger generation today, what do they need? They need safe places. They don't marry or have kids because they fear expanding their carbon footprint. They fear everything. One life only to live, and so many of them live in an ideological, fearful jail cell. There's one thing we need to fear in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's life under the sun. The rest is management. Right? Second point, be joyful. Light is sweet, how pleasant to see a new day dawning. When people live to be very old, let them rejoice in every day of life. We have the freedom to anticipate the joys God has in store for us. You see, in this life, everything is limited. In this life, if this is the only life there is, I'll be forever trying to hang on to it and to attempt to hoard what ultimately cannot be hoarded. I cannot hoard pleasures. I cannot hoard youth. In case you're wondering, I'm 61, right? We cannot hoard life. These things are like water flowing through our hands. When we look back yearning for the past, we find only regrets and frustrations. But once I realized that the source of all good things is in fact at the source of the river, once you realize that the source of all good things is God Himself, then you will look intensely towards the source of the river, anticipating the day when you will crash into the arms of God, death being but a small bottleneck to that great day. If my life is oriented by God, then it frees me to enjoy all the good things that this life has to offer without regret, for I know that this is not the end. And then thirdly, be faithful to God. Verse 5, remember Him before you become fearful of falling and worry about danger in the streets. Yes, verse 6, remember your Creator now while you're young. As long as there is breath in our body, the struggle never ends. The temptation to abandon God remains always with us. Jesus was well aware of the fact that there are two forces in the world that compete for the hearts and the minds of men and women. One of them is very enticing, seductive. It holds the promise of satisfaction, but in the end, that path only leads to death. The path of the thief, Jesus calls it. The other one is more subtle. No glitter, no fireworks. It's the path offered by Christ. The path that leads to life, the path of the Good Shepherd. And so He explained it to them. I assure you, I am the gate for the sheep, He said. All others who came before me were thieves and robbers, but the true sheep did not listen to them. Yes, I am the gate. Those who come in through me will be saved, and wherever they go, they will find green pastures. The thief's purpose is to steal and kill and destroy. My purpose is to give life in all of its fullness. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes my third session on wisdom literature. I wish we had been able to get to see each other and get to know each other, but it won't be possible this time. I thank you for watching. And should you have any questions, I'm sure that you could communicate those questions to your pastor, and he could communicate it to me. We could either do a live Zoom session at some point, or I could try to answer them in some fashion or another. And in conclusion, I want to wish you a happy new year and God's many blessings on your own personal life and also your congregation. In the meantime, I also would like to leave you. I'm not going to read it now, but it's a long quote from G.K. Chesterton that you could read at your leisure. It speaks of this attribute that we recognize so seldomly. He speaks to joy and the joy that should characterize our lives. So thank you again, and may God bless you richly. And do not hesitate to contact me for any further comments or questions you may have. God bless you.